So I'm going to continue from Richard Tarnas's The Passion of the Western Mind, reading from Chapter 2 on the transformation of the classical era, the section on cross-currents of the Hellenistic matrix. And there's only 3 pages left, and that'll be the end of reading. This 4-part series will be tied together as a package and hopefully bounced around on the internet. So let's begin. The entire universe exists in a continual outflow from the One into created multiplicity, which is then drawn back to the One, a process of emanation and return, always moved by the One's superfluity of perfection. The philosopher's task is to overcome the human bondage to the physical realm, by moral and intellectual self-discipline and purification, and to turn inward to a gradual ascent back to the Absolute. The final moment of illumination transcends knowledge in any usual sense, and cannot be defined or described, for it is based on an overcoming of the subject-object dichotomy between the seeker and the goal. It is a consummation of contemplative desire that unites the philosopher with the One. Thus Plotinus articulated an elaborately coherent, rationalist and idealist metaphysics, which found its fulfillment in a unitary, mystical apprehension of the supreme Godhead. With confident and meticulous precision, and in often startlingly beautiful prose, Plotinus described the complex nature of the universe and its participation in the divine, basing his philosophy on the Platonic doctrine of transcendent ideas. He then added or drew out several new defining features: teleological dynamism, hierarchy, emanation, and a super-rational mysticism. In this form, Neoplatonism became the final expression of classical pagan philosophy, and it assumed the role of Platonism's historical carrier in subsequent centuries. Both Neoplatonism and astrology transcended the intellectual bifurcation of the Hellenistic era, and, like much else in classical culture, both were the result of Greek thought forms penetrating and intermingling with non-Hellenic cultural impulses. Each in its own way would have an enduring, if sometimes hidden, influence on later Western thought. Yet despite astrology's near-universal popularity in the Hellenistic world, and despite Neoplatonism's well-received renovation of pagan philosophy in the last years of the academies, by the late classical era, new, powerful forces had begun to impinge on the Greco-Roman consciousness. In the end, the restless spirit of the Hellenistic era was to seek its redemption in a new quarter altogether. With the several important exceptions already cited, the latter efforts of Hellenic culture in the classical period appeared to lack the daring intellectual optimism and curiosity that had been characteristic of the earlier Greeks. At least on the surface, Hellenistic civilization seemed remarkable more for its variety than its force, more for its worldly intelligence than its inspired genius, more for its sustaining and elaboration of past cultural achievements than its origination of new ones. Many significant currents were at work, but the whole did not cohere. The cultural outlook was unsettled, alternately skeptical and dogmatic, syncretistic and fragmented. The highly organized centers of learning seemed to have a discouraging effect on individual genius. Already by the time of Rome's conquest of Greece in the 2nd century BC, the Hellenic impulse was fading, displaced by the more Oriental view of human subordination to the overwhelming powers of the supernatural. This next part is called Rome. In Rome, however, classical civilization experienced an expansive autumnal flowering, spurred first by the Republic's militaristic and libertarian ethos, and then nourished by the Pax Romana established during the long imperial reign of Caesar Augustus. With political shrewdness and steadfast patriotism, and fortified by belief in their guiding deities, the Romans succeeded not only in conquering the entire Mediterranean basin and a large part of Europe, but also in fulfilling their perceived mission of extending their civilization throughout the known world. Without that conquest, made possible by the ruthless military tactics and ambitious political genius of leaders like Julius Caesar, it is unlikely the positive legacy of classical culture would have survived, in the West or the East, the pressures of later barbarian and Oriental assaults. Roman culture itself contributed significantly to the classical achievement. Cicero, Virgil, Horace, and Livy brought the Latin language, under the influence of the Greek masters, to an eloquent maturity. The Greek paideia found new life in the Roman aristocracy's humanitas, Cicero's Latin translation of paideia. The liberal education founded on the classics. Greek mythology was conflated with and preserved in Roman mythology, and through the works of Ovid and Virgil passed on to Western posterity. Roman legal thought, containing a new sense of objective rationality and natural law derived from the Greek concept of the universal logos, introduced systematic clarity into commercial and legal interactions throughout the empire, cutting through the welter of divergent local customs and evolving principles of contract law and property ownership, crucial for the West's later development. The sheer energy and massiveness of the Roman enterprise commanded the awe of the ancient world, but Rome's cultural splendor was an imitatio, albeit inspired, of Greece's glory, and its magnitude alone could not indefinitely sustain the Hellenic spirit. Although nobility of character often evidenced itself in the turmoil of political life, the Roman ethos gradually lost its vitality. The very success of the empire's inordinate military and commercial activity, divorced from deeper motivations, was weakening the fiber of the Roman citizenry. Most scientific activity, let alone genius, radically diminished in the empire soon after Galen and Ptolemy in the 2nd century, and the excellence of Latin literature began to wane in the same period. Faith in human progress, so broadly visible in the cultural fluorescence of 5th century BC Greece, and sporadically expressed, usually by scientists and technologists in the Hellenistic age, virtually disappeared in the final centuries of the Roman Empire. Classical civilization's finest hours were by then all in the past, and the various factors that brought on Rome's fall, oppressive and rapacious government, over-ambitious generals, constant barbarian incursions, an aristocracy grown decadent and effete, religious cross-currents underlying the imperial authority and military ethos, drastic sustained inflation, pestilential diseases, a dwindling population without resilience or focus, all contributed further to the apparent death of the Greek-inspired world. Yet beneath the glittering decay of classical culture, and from within the wellspring of the Hellenistic religious matrix, a new world had been slowly and inexorably taking form. This last part or section of the 2nd chapter is called the Emergence of Christianity. Considered as a single entity, classical Greco-Roman civilization arose, flourished, and declined in the course of 1,000 years. At about the midpoint of this millennium, in the remote districts of Galilee and Judea, on the periphery of the Roman Empire, the young Jewish religious leader, Jesus of Nazareth, lived, taught, and died. His radical religious message was embraced by a small but fervently inspired group of Jewish disciples, who believed that after his death by crucifixion, Jesus had risen again and revealed himself as the Christ, the Anointed One, the world's Lord and Savior. A new stage in the religion was reached with the advent of Paul of Tarsus, who was Jewish by birth, Roman by citizenship, and Greek by culture. While on his way to Damascus to restrain further spread of what he viewed as a heretical sect dangerous to Judaic orthodoxy, Paul was overwhelmed by a vision of the risen Christ. He then ardently espoused the very religion of which he had been the most forceful opponent, and indeed became its preeminent missionary and foundational theologian. Under Paul's leadership, the small religious movement rapidly spread to other parts of the empire, Asia Minor, Egypt, Greece, to Rome itself, and began to constitute itself as a world church. In the course of the unsettled Hellenistic era, something like a spiritual crisis appears to have arisen in the culture, its members impelled by newly conscious needs for personal significance in the cosmos and personal knowledge of life's meaning. To these needs, the various mystery religions, public cults, esoteric systems, and philosophical schools all spoke. But it was Christianity that, after intermittent periods of severe persecution by the Roman state, gradually emerged as the victor. The turning point of this process came in the early 4th century with the Epical Conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine, who thereafter committed himself and his imperial power to Christianity's propagation. The classical world was drastically transformed in its final centuries by the influx of the Christian religion from the east and the massive invasions of the Germanic barbarians from the north. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity had become the official state religion of the Roman Empire, and by the end of the 5th, the last Roman emperor in the west had been deposed by a barbarian king. On the face of it, classical civilization had been snuffed out in the West, its great works and ideas left to the Byzantines and later to the Muslims to be preserved as in a museum. As Edward Gibbon would pointedly epitomize in his History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, quote, "I have described the triumph of barbarism and religion, but from a long view of the West's complex evolution, these new forces did not entirely eliminate or supplant the Greco-Roman culture as much as they engrafted their own distinctive elements onto the highly developed and deeply rooted classical foundation. Despite the decline of Europe into cultural isolation and inactivity during the following centuries, especially as compared with the flourishing Byzantine and Islamic empires, the restless enterprising vigor of the Germanic peoples combined with the civilizing influence of the Roman Catholic Church, to forge a culture that was, in another 1,000 years, to give birth to the modern West. These Middle Ages, between the classical era and the Renaissance, were thus a gestation period of considerable consequence. The Church served as the one institution uniting the West and sustaining a connection with classical civilization. The barbarians, for their part, did two remarkable things. They converted to Christianity, while they simultaneously set about the enormous task of learning and integrating the rich intellectual heritage of the classical culture they had just conquered. This great scholastic labor, slowly carried out over the 1,000-year period, first in the monasteries and later in the universities, encompassed not only Greek philosophy and letters, as well as Roman political thought, but also the now impressive body of theological writings by the ancient Christian fathers, culminating in the work of Augustine, who wrote in the early 5th century just as the Roman Empire was collapsing around him under the impact of the barbarian invasions. It was from this complex fusion of racial, political, religious, and philosophical elements that there gradually arose a comprehensive worldview common to Western Christendom. Succeeding that of the classical Greeks as the governing vision of the